Welcome to the WTIM morning show. I'm your host, Avery Cooper. Your stream co-sponsored by Landmark of Taylorville, where you always do better with Landmark and People's Bank and Trust, where they put people first. I'm here with Tenasca's technical expert, Andrew Duguid. Did I say that right, Andrew? Close enough. And project spokesperson, Jim Prescott. Welcome to the program to you both.
Morning, Avery. Good to be here.
All right. So first off, Jim, what is Heartland Greenway?
Well, that's the basic question, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk about it this morning. Heartland Greenway is a carbon capture and storage project, which is a mouthful, but basically it is a project that's the technology for carbon capture is evolved and is in such a way that this project in particular will remove carbon emissions from ethanol and biofuel plants, liquefy it and put it in pipelines and send it to a storage space facility. It's a multi-state project, involves 5 different states. The storage facility, the storage space is here in Christian County. Tenasca's got a history here with Christian County. Some of your listeners may recall the Taylorville Energy Center from about 10 years or so ago. So we're in the very early stages of this project. We're still reaching out to landowners. Have not submitted for any permits yet, so we have a long way to go.
And how does this work? Assuming that this project is all approved and you get it all done, how would it work?
Well, it's a process that's designed to capture carbon and permanently store it. It's part of the solution to deal with environmental regulations. That's especially important for biofuel and ethanol producers. The regulatory standards that they have to meet are getting tougher and tougher every year, and we don't think that's going to change in the foreseeable future. So what this does is a process of removing carbon dioxide from those processes, and then after it's captured, it's compressed, put in pipelines, and sent to the storage facility. And it's frankly a way to permanently store CO2 so it doesn't get released into the atmosphere. From a larger standpoint, from a benefit side of it, as I mentioned, it's a way for biofuel producers and ethanol producers to meet those environmental standards. What that will do from a business standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, is keep them in business. If anything, it may even give them an opportunity to expand their businesses, keep people employed. It also, for farmers, gives the ag community another marketplace. It strengthens that marketplace as a place for their crops to go and be produced and be a productive part of the economy.
Andrew, I think many want to know, from a technical standpoint, is carbon capture and storage safe?
Yeah. So it's very safe. So all the way through, from capture all the way through storage, it's highly regulated and highly monitored. On the storage side, which is going to affect the listeners here, I think people really want to understand, what keeps CO2 in the ground. And so when you're doing a CO2 project, you're looking for a very specific set of conditions. You need the right depth, and then you need the right kind of rocks. And the depth allows us to keep the CO2 in a liquid or a supercritical form, so a very dense fluid. And then the right kinds of rocks means you have somewhere to put it and somewhere to keep it down. So what you end up with is a rock formation deep underground. And in this part of the world, it's about a mile underground, that has a lot of space between the grains of rock. So there's a sandstone, and there's space in between the rock to put the CO2. But above that, we need a layer of rock that does not allow CO2 to move through it. And that's actually what we have in this part of the country, is a thick shale that keeps CO2 in the ground. So what we'll do is we'll put the carbon dioxide in the ground, and it will get stuck under that layer of rock and be there forever. And then we will monitor it very carefully throughout the project and after the project to make sure it's acting as we expect it to behave.
Can you expand a little bit more about what makes this spot in Christian County safe for CCS?
Sure. So we've actually done quite a bit of characterization. The U.S. Department of Energy and the Illinois State Geologic Survey have had projects in the past where they've drilled wells. And there's actually two projects, in Decatur, Illinois, where they are currently injecting this. So the site of the Farm Progress show, there's actually a working injection well there right now, and it's going on. So we know in this part of the world with these specific rocks that this is safe and it's carefully studied. And I actually helped build those projects and have been doing some of the sort of primary research on the safety throughout my career. So I know personally that it's safe, and then we know as a team that it is safe.
Where else can you find carbon capture and storage?
So the carbon injection projects and carbon capture has been around since the 1970s to produce oil and gas. That is not what we're doing here. This is slightly different. And the carbon storage projects, just strictly for storage purposes, have been around since the 1990s. There are projects in the United States, Canada, Australia, and in Norway. And the one in Norway is actually out in the ocean and not onshore. But those are the big projects that are currently operating. Mm-hmm. Then with the change in sort of regulations in the past couple of years in the US and in other places, there are hundreds of projects being planned right now all around the country.
And Avery, I just want to expand on one point that
ahead.
Andrew just touched on, which is that this is not an enhanced oil recovery project. I was just talking to, we have a project office here in Taylorville, and I was in there this morning and chatted for a couple of minutes with the manager of the land team. And he said a couple of landowners, and we're reaching out to landowners in the storage space. We've got a couple of hundred or so landowners we're dealing with. Some of them have reached out to us and asked, is this enhanced oil recovery? Is this got anything to do with that? And it does not. That's more commonly known, Andrew, I think it's probably safe to say most folks know that as fracking. But that's not what this is. This has nothing to do with that at all. We're not going to take anything. There's no commercial connection to fracking with this project whatsoever.
Right, which leads into my question of where does this carbon come from? Right, because with fracking, you're taking the oil out of the ground in a way, and technically, I don't understand it, but that's my basic understanding. Yeah. Where does the CO2 come from?
So let's back up just a little bit. So fracking is actually it's hydraulically fracturing the rocks. You are actually pushing water into the rock to break it to allow you to produce oil and gas. When we go for our permits, we will be specifically not allowed to make pressure in the ground high enough to break rock. So by law, we will not be allowed to fracture rocks. So that's one first difference between this and fracking. The CO2 comes from the fermentation process for the ethanol plant. So that when they take the corn and ferment it to make ethanol, CO2 is a byproduct. It's bubbles in beer, right? That also comes from fermentation. So it's exactly the same. And then it's because you're fermenting, it's very pure and it's relatively inexpensive to capture, which allows ethanol plants to capture it and take part in this process. And that's why they are asking Navigator to build Heartland Greenway.
And then I understand it's stored way below the ground, but how is it stored or where? How or where?
Yeah, so I was kind of describing that earlier, and it's really difficult, maybe especially on radio, but if you take your fingers and you put them together, and you have a tiny little window between each, you'll take your thumb and finger and pinch them together, put each thumb and finger together, you have a tiny little window in between.
Right.
If each one of those fingers and thumbs is a grain of sand,
right,
that little space is where the CO2 goes. But there are, not quite infinite, but there are millions and millions of little spaces in a sandstone where you put this. So we're actually going to inject, so we're going to push the CO2 into each one of these little spaces, and that's where it's going to stay in the sandstone. And then that cap rock that I mentioned, that shale, which is the Eau Claire shale, which is a couple 100 feet thick, and it's going to trap the CO2 in the Mount Simon sandstone.
From a technical standpoint, Andrew, how excited are you to be working on this project?
I'm actually really excited about this project. I was part of the team that worked on the first time around also with Tenaska and Taylorville. So it was a great site then, and it's still a great site. And this project, it's a really big step for these plants that need to meet these regulations. So it's a big deal.
Do you have anything to add, Jim?
Well, I mentioned earlier, and as Andrew said, and I was involved in that project 10 years or so ago as well. So it's a great opportunity to come back to Christian County, come back to Taylorville, and with a project that reflects how technology has changed, but also meets a demand from an environmental standpoint and from a commercial and business standpoint. All in all, it's a terrific opportunity.
You are listening to the WTIM Morning Show. I'm Avery Cooper, your host. That is Heartland Greenway's technical expert, Andrew Duguid, and you just heard from project spokesperson Jim Prescott from Tenaska. right here on the WTIM Morning Show. Your stream co-sponsored by Landmark of Taylorville, where you always do better with Landmark and People's Bank and Trust, where they put people first.
President. Well, as of February 15th, it appears that the school mask mandate is dying a slow death. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and the Illinois Department of Public Health first instituted the mask mandate in schools at the start of the COVID pandemic back in 2020. The Illinois Department of Public Health tried to reinstitute the school mask mandate after a Sangamon County Circuit judge threw out the mandate for the 166 school districts that sued Pritzker, claiming it was illegal. But the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, a bipartisan group of Illinois state senators and representatives, ruled on February 15th that IDPH's reissuance of the school mask mandate was not enforceable. All of this chaos was created by Pritzker and his agencies to try and mitigate the COVID pandemic. First, they shut down the schools and then went to remote learning, which was a disaster, putting kids behind in learning and taxing the mental health of both children and their parents. Then came the mask mandate once schools reopened, which led to more executive orders. Now, nearly 2 years after the pandemic first started, it appears as though the school mask mandate in Illinois is finally dead. Thank God. While the governor and the IDPH continue to wait on a remedy from the courts, school districts across the state took the JCAR ruling on February 15th as permission to return to life as we know it. Finally. I heard a Northwestern University doctor recently say that with around 80% of the country having at least one vaccine shot and many people building natural immunity after having the virus itself, plus many more ways to treat those who now get it, it's time to get on with life. I couldn't have said it better myself. I just hope the governor stops this power grab continuing to control Illinois schools. I thought that's why we elect local school boards. And Governor, don't forget, it's an election year. That's our opinion. We welcome yours. Our email address is editorial@randyradio.com. That's editorial@randyradio.com.
Computer Techniques, also known as CTI, is bringing fiber internet to local homes and businesses. For lag-free internet with speeds up to 1 gig, find out more by clicking their icon at TaylorvilleDailyNews.com.
Westervelt Mutual Insurance has always been there to provide the best coverage and protection we could find for our home, and will continue to do so for years to come. Find an agent near you by clicking their icon at TaylorvilleDailyNews.com.
Welcome back to the WTIM Morning Show. I'm your host, Avery Cooper. Your stream is co-sponsored by Landmark of Taylorville, where you always do better with Landmark and People's Bank and Trust, where they put people first. I'm here with Tenaska's Heartland Greenway technical expert Andrew Duguid and project spokesperson Jim Prescott. So, Heartland Greenway, we know it's a carbon capture and storage project. What is this timeline looking like right now? I understand things could go pretty fluid with projects as big as this, but on paper, what is the timeline look right now?
So the timeline for the storage side of this is probably, if everything goes really well, about the next 3 years to have things installed and complete and ready to go when the other end of the project, that the pipeline is ready and ready to deliver CO2.
I understand a big part of that is obtaining the right permits. And anyway, continue to elaborate on that.
That's right. So for the storage project, the absolutely necessary permit is a Class 6 injection well permit. So part of the underground injection control program that is run by the U.S. EPA. So we actually have to go for a separate permit for each well that will be doing injecting, and that takes probably about 2 years. We have to meet all of EPA's needs to make that go that quickly. It could certainly go longer if something goes wrong, but that's the anticipated timeline.
And let me just add that that is one of the hardest permits to obtain. The requirements for a Class 6 permit the bar is very high. Let's just put it that way. And when Andrew said it takes 2 years to get it, it is a very busy 2-year process with an enormous amount of detail. And as you mentioned, each well needs a permit.
Right. You also mentioned too, you kind of touched on it a little bit. This is kind of just call it part 1A and part 1B of the project, because they're two different projects, but they are right together, and one can't work without the other.
Exactly.
Right.
It's all Heartland Greenway,
Right.
but it is a parallel track for the permits and the landowner negotiations for the pipeline, and a parallel track for the permits and negotiations with landowners here in Christian County for the storage space. So it's like two projects in one, but it's all Heartland Greenway.
And I should say, so the initial permit, if everything went well, 2 years from now, we get a permit to construct. And that allows us to drill our wells. It doesn't allow us to inject. So what we have to do is actually go and use all the information that we collect from these wells to prove that the project's going to be safe now that we have the wells. And then we go back to EPA and essentially have to go through the process again. And so there's when he was talking about it being a really stringent process, that's the stringent process. And EPA is very particular about making sure that we are protecting groundwater. And that's why we have to have the permit at all.
And going into that a little bit, I'm sure the public wants to know how this is being monitored. And
that's right.
It seems like part of that is just the permit gathering process you guys are going through the hoops and to make sure that is being monitored that way. But once it is constructed, everything's done, how is that going to be monitored beyond the construction?
So that's right. So during the permit process, we develop a monitoring plan, and that actually describes the monitoring we're going to be doing at the site. And so that monitoring is continuous 24/7 in some technologies, and then periodic in others. But we will be continuously monitoring all the wells, monitoring their pressure, their temperature, at the bottom where we're injecting, at the top where the CO2 is coming in. And then we'll actually have a fiber optic line, almost like a phone line, that's capable of telling us the temperature along the well. So if you've ever sprayed spray-on deodorant and it gets cold,
right?
If CO2 were moving along our well, it'll get cold the same way. And so we can actually look for a temperature change. And as long as we don't see a temperature change, we know the well is operating as expected. If we do see it, we can just shut down and fix it. And then we have to report that to EPA. So that's one of the things we do for monitoring that allows us to ensure that we are operating safely 24/7 the entire time the project is running.
When the project is up and running and active, what does the process look like above ground?
So above ground, and there are some shallow oil and gas wells in the area. So you'll see a pump jack. We won't have a pump jack, but you will be able to see a wellhead. So above ground, you will see our wellheads for the injection wells, and then we have about 12 monitoring wells planned also. They will also have a wellhead. They will kind of ring the project, and then some over on top of the project. And so you'll see those wellheads. But beyond that, there will be very little to tell you that there's a project going on. Again, like I mentioned out at the Farm Progress Show, you might go out there and park and never realize what's going on. It's the same way. Farmers here with their fields, they want to go plant, and they can drive over this thing. They can use their land exactly the way they've always used it.
Well, sounds like you have the plans all laid out. What's next for you?
Continue to work with the landowners, prepare the permit applications, which will probably take the better part of this year. At some point later this year, at least for the storage space, the plan is to start that process. And then we're also in the process of doing a lot of outreach to landowners. We've had one open house meeting in November. We had one we had to postpone with the winter storm a couple of weeks ago. We have another one this Tuesday night at Taylorville High School. As I mentioned, we've got a project office. We'll do some open houses there in March on the 9th and 10th. So we want to make sure that landowners, as well as the Christian County public at large, know about this project, understand it, and if they have questions, they know where they can get them answered.
Anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, CCS is one of the safest technologies, and as I mentioned earlier, it's evolved in such a way that it is a proven technology. And as we've discussed, it's also here in Christian County. It's nearby over in Decatur, next door, in the county next door in Macon County. But it is a proven technology, and we want to make sure that folks get as many questions answered as possible. And that's why we're here this morning. We appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jim and Andrew.
Thank you.
The Big 870 WTIM Assumption Taylorville, 96.1 W241 CF Taylorville, 107.